She said, "Change your will or we're done." My daughter, my only child, said it the way you'd tell a waiter to change your order if the soup came cold. It was morning, soft light spilling through the kitchen window, dust floating in the air like slow snow, the coffee between us already cooling. I remember the sound more than the words. The tiny metallic clink of her spoon against the mug, the sound of distance becoming permanent. I didn't answer right away. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, she might hear herself, might realize what she'd just said to the woman who gave her every last bit of stability she ever had. But Melissa never did well with silence. She filled it fast, like a person afraid of what might crawl out of it. She leaned forward, the skin around her eyes tightening. "I'm serious, Mom. You're not thinking clearly. That charity doesn't need your money. We do." That word, we. She said it like an inheritance, as if family was a bank account waiting to be liquidated. I am 82 years old. I live alone in the same house where I once tucked her in every night, kissed her forehead, and told her she could be anything. I meant it. I still do, though she's long since chosen to be something else entirely. The house creaks more than it used to. The walls carry voices. Hers, my late husband's. Mine, when I still believed that motherhood meant permanence. Sometimes, when the heater clicks on, I imagine it's breathing, the house, sighing from exhaustion after years of holding up our stories. I've stayed here not because I'm stuck, but because it's the only place that still tells the truth about me. Every corner carries a version of who I was before people started deciding what I should do with what's left of my life. The morning she came, I'd baked scones, cranberry orange, her favorite as a child. I set out the good plates, the ones with the blue border, and even polished the sugar spoon. I thought we'd talk about her new job, her son's school, the garden I'd finally replanted after the frost. She arrived in that efficient way she always does, coat still on, phone in hand, perfume too sharp for breakfast. "You look good," she said, which in her language means, "You look old, but not alarming." She glanced around the kitchen like a realtor assessing property, eyes flicking over the table, the curtains, the old photos on the wall. When she sat down, she didn't touch the pastry. She didn't even unwrap her scarf. Her tone had that flat, managerial warmth I'd come to dread. "Mom, I've been thinking about your will." I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because that's what you do when the person you love says something unspeakable. You laugh to buy time, to reassemble your heart before it falls apart in front of them. "That's a strange topic for a Saturday," I said, but she was already unzipping her handbag, sliding a neat stack of papers onto the table. "It's not strange, it's practical. You said you wanted things to be simple." "I talked to a lawyer. He can make sure everything's clear." I looked down at the pages. My name printed in clean, legal font. Her name beneath it. The charity, crossed out in red ink. She'd done it herself. Not even the decency of a reprint, just her corrections, her certainty, her belief that I'd fold. I don't think I'll ever forget the way the light hit her face at that moment. The same angle I used to see when she was 5, leaning over her cereal bowl, milk mustache on her lip. She still had that little frown line, the one that appeared whenever she didn't get her way. Back then, it was about an extra cookie. Now, it was about control. "You've done enough giving," she said, as if generosity were a disease I refused to treat. "You need to think of family now." Family. That word again, heavy, weaponized, stripped of affection. I took a slow sip of my coffee, even though it had gone cold. My hands didn't tremble. I wanted her to see that. "I am thinking of family," I said quietly. "Just not the same way you are." She sighed, that exaggerated exhale of someone rehearsing patience. "Mom, I don't want to fight, but if you're going to keep making irrational choices, I don't know if I can keep doing this." This, meaning visits, calls, the fragile pretense of care. Her tone was gentle, but the words had edges. I remember staring at her fingers, manicured, pink polish, the same hands that once reached for mine when she was scared of thunderstorms. I wondered when they'd stopped holding things gently. When she left that morning, she didn't hug me. She just gathered her papers, tucked them neatly into her bag, and said, "Think about it. Please. Don't make me the bad guy." Then she kissed the air beside my cheek and was gone, heels clicking down the walkway like a gavel. The sound echoed long after the door closed. I stood there, half leaning on the counter, the smell of coffee and citrus filling the kitchen, and felt the oddest thing. Not anger, not grief, but a deep, hollow astonishment. You raise a child to stand on her own, and one day she does, right on your chest. For the rest of the day, I moved through the house in silence. Washed the plates, wrapped the untouched scones, watered the plants. I didn't cry. I didn't even curse. I just kept thinking about how easily love can disguise ownership, how invisible the line becomes when affection turns into leverage. Every mother I know fears two things: being forgotten and being needed only for what she can still give. That morning, I realized I had reached the second fear's finish line. By evening, I found myself in the living room, looking at the framed photo of Melissa as a little girl in her school uniform, grinning gap-toothed beside the mailbox we painted together. The frame was dusted, the glass still clear, but the memory behind it felt far away, like a song you used to hum but can't recall the tune of. I whispered, "You were so small," and it sounded like an apology, though I wasn't sure to whom. Outside, the neighborhood had gone quiet. Dusk slipped through the curtains. I thought of calling her back, just to say something neutral, ask about her day, her husband, the boy. But I didn't. I knew that if I called, I'd end up explaining myself, defending my choices, as if a lifetime of mothering didn't earn me the right to decide where my love goes when I'm gone. Instead, I sat there and listened to the house. Every creak sounded like memory adjusting its weight. I remembered her first steps on that same floor, the stain from her teenage art project, still faintly visible near the baseboard. The thought made me smile, briefly, before it broke my heart again. When night fell, I took the old will out of the desk drawer. Not to read it, just to feel the paper, the weight of it. I traced my name with my finger. People think wills are about death. They're not. They're about voice, about making sure that when you're gone, you still speak for yourself. That night, for the first time, I began to wonder if maybe I needed to speak louder. I went to bed without turning on the lamp. The dark was comforting, almost maternal. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard cracked like a sigh. I thought of Melissa's face, the way she looked at me as if I were an obstacle instead of a mother, and I realized I'd crossed into a new kind of loneliness, one that doesn't ache. It observes. I turned on my side, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and whispered to the empty room. If she wants me to change my will, I will. Just not the way she expects. Then I closed my eyes and let the thought settle, calm and certain as breath. 2 weeks passed before she called again, and by then I had rehearsed a dozen versions of calm responses I would never get to use. Her number flashed on the screen while I was outside cutting dead hydrangeas, the shears cold in my palm. I watched the phone vibrate on the porch railing until it stopped. Then I waited for the message. It came, of course. Her voice softer now. Honey poured over glass. Mom, can we talk? I didn't mean to upset you. I just think we need to be realistic. Realistic, I thought. The word she uses when she's about to do something cruel in a polite tone. I called her back anyway. Some part of me still believed that if we just spoke without that defensive distance between us, we might find our way back to something resembling love. When she answered, there was traffic noise behind her, a car horn, the sound of her rushing through life. Hi, Mom. I'm glad you called. Her voice carried relief, but also control, as if this had gone according to plan. I was worried you were taking it personally. I almost laughed. Taking what personally, Melissa? That my daughter threatened to erase herself from my life unless I rewrote the story of it? There was a pause, long enough for me to hear her inhale. That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said. Silence again. I just meant... She began, but I stopped listening. I watched the light change on the lawn, the shadows of the hydrangeas stretching across the soil like ribs. She finally said, I've spoken with a financial advisor. It's not about the money, Mom. It's about making sure things are organized. You've worked hard all your life, and I just want it to go where it can actually do good. I almost admired the phrasing. The cruelty wrapped in civility, the manipulation disguised as management. You mean where you can manage it, I said quietly. She exhaled, a sound of mild exasperation, as if she were speaking to a stubborn child. You always make everything emotional. And you always make everything transactional, I replied. I could hear the shift in her tone, that low, warning register she used when she wanted to end a conversation on her terms. Fine, she said at last. If you want to be difficult, I'll have to make sure things are handled differently. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. I'd raised that tone myself. I knew it carried threat disguised as efficiency. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my armchair by the window, the one that faces the garden, and watched the faint movement of tree branches against the dark. There was a wind, restless and uneven. It made the old glass rattle. The house felt uneasy, as if it too sensed something shifting under its foundations. I thought about the way she had said, handled differently. I thought about what that might mean when spoken by someone who'd already reduced her mother to a signature. For the first time, I felt something like fear, not of her, but of how invisible love becomes when rewritten in legal language. The following morning, a letter arrived. The envelope was stiff, corporate, addressed to me but printed from an office machine. I knew before opening it that it had her fingerprints all over it. Inside was a form letter from a firm I didn't recognize, offering guidance on estate restructuring and inheritance protection. The words were neutral, bloodless, yet the implication screamed through the paper. She had gone ahead without me. She was setting the stage. I sat at the kitchen table, reading it twice, then folding it neatly back into the envelope, the way you fold a flag over something lost. That was the moment. The true fracture. Not her words at the table, not the tone of irritation, or even the arrogance of youth pretending to know better. It was this, the quiet erasure of my consent, the redefinition of my autonomy as a problem to be managed. I had seen women my age go through it, their adult children speaking about them as if they were already gone, saying things like, "She's not herself anymore," or "We just want to help." It's a polite sort of burial that happens while you're still breathing. That morning, with the envelope in front of me, I understood I had stepped onto that slope. Around noon, she called again. "Did you get the letter?" she asked, as if she were confirming a delivery, not a betrayal. I said I had. "Good," she continued. "I think once you meet with them, you'll see it's all for the best. They can help you update everything." "Melissa," I said slowly, "do you realize what you're doing?" She hesitated. "I'm trying to protect you." "From whom?" I asked. "From yourself," she said. And that was when something inside me went completely still. The wind outside had died down. The house was quiet. Even the clock seemed to hesitate. I said nothing. She began filling the silence again, words spilling over each other, about taxes, about charities that exploit old people, about how things could get messy if I don't act now. I let her talk until she ran out of sentences. Then I said very softly, "I'm not your ward, Melissa. I'm your mother. Remember the difference." And then I hung up. Afterward, I walked through the house as though I were inspecting a scene of quiet vandalism. Everything was in its place, yet everything felt tampered with. The air had changed texture. I found myself opening drawers, touching objects that had no connection to her. An old scarf, a postcard from Italy, a letter from my husband, written in blue ink the year before he died. I read it again, tracing his words. "Don't let the world shrink you, even when it calls it care." He'd known somehow how the world works on women like me, slowly convincing us that shrinking is the same as safety. By evening, I realized I couldn't stay passive. I'd always been the kind of woman who resolved crises quietly, paid bills, soothed tempers, swallowed hurt for peace. But this wasn't peace. This was an erasure written in polite language. I made tea and sat with my checkbook, my insurance papers, my small collection of bank folders. The pile looked like a life reduced to columns and balances. I thought of all the times I'd given Melissa what she wanted: money for college, a down payment on her first condo, the bailout after her second divorce. I never called it generosity. I called it love. But love that demands proof eventually becomes a transaction, and I was done being an account she could draw from. That night I wrote her a letter. It wasn't angry. Anger would have given her power, suggested she'd still owned my reactions. I wrote, "I received your paperwork. I won't be signing anything. You seem to have mistaken my calm for confusion. I'm neither frail nor lost. I know exactly what I'm doing and why. Please take care of your own affairs. I'll handle mine." I sealed the envelope and left it by the door, intending to mail it in the morning. I didn't sleep much. The moonlight fell across the hallway, catching on the framed photos, each one a fragment of a life she wanted to rearrange. I felt something gather inside me. Not rage, but a strange clarity, a kind of awakening that only arrives when someone tries to write your ending for you. The next morning, she arrived unannounced. No warning, no call, just the sound of her car door slamming and her voice in the hallway. "Mom? You home?" She sounded brisk, cheerful in that artificial way that comes before an ambush. I met her in the kitchen. "You didn't answer my calls," she said. I gestured to the kettle. "I've been busy thinking." "About the will?" she asked, trying to sound light. About life, I said. She frowned, and for a moment I saw something almost like guilt flicker across her face, but it vanished quickly. I didn't mean to make you feel pressured, she said. I just think it's time to be realistic. There it was again, that word. I realized she used it the way people use prayers, to justify whatever they fear might be wrong. We sat down. She had that tight, managerial posture, legs crossed, hands clasped, voice pitched low and reasonable. If you change the will now, Mom, you can avoid all kinds of problems later. Taxes, probate, confusion. I'm just trying to help you keep control. I smiled, genuinely this time, because I saw the irony blooming like a bruise between us. You mean help you gain control, I said. Her jaw stiffened. Why do you always assume the worst? I wanted to tell her that it's not assumption when the evidence arrives in an envelope, but instead I said, because I've lived long enough to recognize the difference between love and leverage. Something in her broke then, or maybe it hardened. I'm not sure which. She stood up abruptly, grabbed her purse, and said, Fine. If you want to make this difficult, that's your choice. But don't expect me to keep pretending we're fine. I didn't answer. She hesitated at the door, waiting, I think, for me to beg, to reach out, to surrender the last bit of dignity for the illusion of closeness. I stayed seated. When she finally walked out, her heels hit the tiles in sharp little verdicts. After she was gone, the silence was enormous. It pressed against my ribs like a physical weight. I picked up her cup from the table, half-drunk coffee, lipstick on the rim, and carried it to the sink. The cup slipped slightly in my hand, and for a brief second, I thought about letting it fall, just to hear the clean finality of porcelain shattering. But I didn't. I washed it, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. Some endings don't need noise. They just need acknowledgement. That was the day I understood what she meant by, we're done. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a declaration. And in a strange way, it felt like freedom. The days that followed settled into an uncanny stillness, the kind that seeps into a house when something unspoken has shifted. The phone stopped ringing. No calls from Melissa, no polite check-ins, no carefully modulated texts asking about my blood pressure or my sleep. Just silence, dense and deliberate. I told myself it was a relief, that I'd wanted quiet after so many weeks of tension. But the truth was more complicated. Silence can sound like peace until you realize it's also a form of punishment. I moved through the rooms of the house like someone visiting a museum of their own life, touching objects not for comfort, but for evidence, proof that I had once existed as more than an afterthought. The kettle still whistled at 7. The mail still came at 10. The cat from next door still scratched at the back step demanding scraps. Everything behaved as if nothing had happened, and yet the air felt altered, metallic, like it was holding its breath. I began to notice small things. The way the mailmen now delivered envelopes addressed not just to me, but to the estate of Margaret Hill, as if I were already half buried. It wasn't his fault. It was some clerical misprint. Still, it felt like an omen. At the grocery store, the young cashier asked if I needed help carrying my bags to the car, and when I said no, she smiled too brightly, as if she were indulging me. I drove home more carefully than usual, aware of how the world begins to treat you like a child once your hair turns white. That evening, I found a voicemail on the machine from a polite man named Tom Andrews, who introduced himself as a financial advisor. Working with your daughter, Melissa, on matters concerning your long-term planning. He said he'd be happy to schedule a consultation at your convenience. His voice was smooth, rehearsed, kind in the way professional kindness often is, completely impersonal. I deleted it without calling back, but for the rest of the night, his voice echoed faintly in the corners of my mind, like a fly trapped between glass and curtain. The next morning, I woke before dawn, restless, uneasy. The dream I'd had evaporated too quickly to remember, only leaving behind a faint residue of urgency. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the first pale light crawl over the lawn. The dew sparkled like frost. Somewhere, a dog barked, and the sound carried through the still air like something alive. I thought of Melissa's voice on that last visit, calm, managerial, so certain of her own righteousness. I wondered when certainty had replaced compassion in her vocabulary. It wasn't always this way. I could still recall the girl who cried over injured birds, who saved worms after the rain, who slept curled up beside me after her father died because she couldn't stand the quiet of her own room. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who measured affection in compliance and worth in signatures. I tried to tell myself it wasn't malice, that maybe she was just afraid of losing control, afraid of aging, afraid of me dying and leaving behind something she couldn't edit. Fear can make people cruel without realizing it, but the thought didn't comfort me. It just made the loss feel larger. The following week, another letter arrived, this time from a law office downtown. The envelope was pale gray, heavy stock, embossed return address. I opened it at the counter with the same detached calm I used to have when opening bills. Inside was a brief, courteous note informing me that Melissa had requested a review of my estate and that an updated copy of my will had been prepared for my consideration. I sat down at the table and read the paragraphs slowly. The words were dry, devoid of sentiment, but each sentence felt like a small theft. They had rewritten my choices into recommendations, my intentions into misunderstandings. The charity I'd supported for 20 years, the one that funds literacy programs for single mothers, had been removed entirely, replaced by a family trust. The closing line read, "Please advise at your earliest convenience so we may finalize the document." No signature from Melissa this time, just the attorney's tidy flourish, as though the intimacy of handwriting were too personal for business. I set the papers aside and stared at the steam rising from my tea. For a long while, I didn't move. There's a strange kind of violence that comes not from shouting or slamming doors, but from the quiet, procedural theft of your own narrative. It was as though I'd been erased on paper before I could even die. I folded the documents back into the envelope, placed them neatly in the drawer beside the phone, and wrote on the front in pen, "Not mine." That small act felt like reclaiming oxygen. Days drifted into one another. I stopped waiting for her to call. I started walking longer routes through the neighborhood, sometimes past the old elementary school where she once performed in the spring play. The building looked smaller now, its paint fading, the playground rusting around the edges. The world ages differently depending on whether you're watching or being watched. I sometimes wondered what the other neighbors thought, seeing me alone. The old woman who used to host family barbecues now walking in the evenings by herself. Maybe they assumed Melissa lived far away, or maybe they knew. Small towns have a way of collecting stories like lint. You never know which ones are about you until you feel the stares. One afternoon, while I was trimming the rose bushes, Mrs. Carter from across the street came over with her usual nosy smile. She asked after Melissa in that syrupy tone that makes every question feel like an accusation. Haven't seen your daughter around lately. Everything all right? I said we were both busy, that she was traveling for work. It was a lie, but an easy one. Mrs. Carter nodded sympathetically and said, "Well, at least she's looking out for you. My boys never think ahead like that." Then she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "She mentioned something about helping you with your finances. Must be such a relief having family you can trust." I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my smile steady. "Yes," I said. "It's good to know I raised a responsible woman." The words tasted like chalk. When she left, I went inside and locked the door, not because I was afraid, but because I suddenly realized how easily the truth could be rewritten through gossip. Melissa had already begun her campaign. Subtle, careful, moralized. I could almost hear her explaining to people that she was worried about Mom's confusion. That evening, I turned off the lights and sat in the living room without music, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional click of the heater. The house had its own pulse. I thought of how my life had gradually become a quiet stage where others performed their narratives of concern. I wasn't supposed to speak anymore, only nod gratefully. That realization hardened something inside me. I decided then that I would not defend myself against whispers. Defense is another kind of submission. I would act instead, not dramatically, but deliberately. The next morning, I called the bank and asked to set up an appointment. Not with anyone she knew, but with a manager I trusted. I spent the afternoon gathering documents, sorting through drawers, feeling both ancient and fiercely alive. Every paper I touched felt like a fragment of identity, something worth protecting. I found an old notebook in which I'd written grocery lists and birthdays, and in the back, a note from Melissa on my 65th birthday. "You're the strongest person I know." I read it twice, then tucked it back inside. Maybe she meant it then. Maybe she even believes it still, buried under her need for control. But belief doesn't erase damage. The next day, I met with the bank manager, a gentle woman named Ruth, who had known me for years. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, leaving out the emotional debris. She listened carefully, then said, "You're not the first, Margaret. It happens more often than people think. Families confuse love with entitlement." Her words landed like stones in a clear pond, rippling outward until they reached something deep inside me. She helped me open a separate account under a different branch. Small, but mine alone. When I left the bank, the air felt different. Cleaner somehow. It wasn't rebellion, it was preservation. That evening, I made soup. Real soup with bones and herbs and patience, the kind Melissa always said took too long. As the house filled with the smell of thyme and garlic, I felt anchored again. I ate slowly, by candlelight, letting the warmth settle in my chest. It occurred to me that independence isn't loud. It's the sound of your own spoon against the bowl, steady and unhurried. But still, the small humiliations crept in. 2 days later, I found a message on my voicemail from the same lawyer, this time more insistent, suggesting that delays in signing could complicate matters. His tone was polite, but there was steel beneath it. I erased the message and replaced the outgoing greeting with a new one. "You've reached Margaret Hill. I'm not taking calls about my will or my money. If this concerns either, please consider the matter closed." I smiled as I spoke, imagining him hearing it, that polished calm cracking just a little. In the evenings, I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since my husband's death. I wrote about the garden, about the quiet rebellion of small decisions. I wrote that silence, once imposed, can be reclaimed as solitude if you choose it. The act of writing steadied me, gave shape to what had been only confusion. The last entry of that week ended with a line I hadn't planned. Maybe the only way to be remembered correctly is to write your own story before someone else edits it. When I put down the pen, the house seemed to breathe with me. I turned off the lamp, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark yard. The hydrangeas stirred faintly in the wind. The cat darted across the fence, and for the first time in months, I felt the stillness, not as absence, but as space. Space to plan, to act, to remember who I was before I became someone else's project. I stood there until the chill crept into my bones, then whispered to the quiet room, "I'm not done yet." And the silence that answered me sounded almost like agreement. It began with a small decision, one so modest I almost didn't notice it as a turning point. I started going to the library on Tuesdays. At first, it was only to escape the house, the stale quiet that clung to the rooms like dust. But soon, it became something else, a ritual of breathing among the living. The library was old, built of brick that smelled faintly of rain, its wooden floors creaking under every step. The front desk was run by a woman named Nora, about my age, with silver hair cut blunt at her jaw, and a voice that sounded like she'd been speaking to children her entire life. She recognized me after my second visit. "You always come when the light's best," she said once, nodding toward the long window near the history shelves. I smiled, surprised by the warmth in her tone. I hadn't realized I'd timed my visits around sunlight. Maybe I was trying to remember what it felt like to sit in brightness without feeling exposed. One afternoon, Nora mentioned that the community center down the street needed volunteers to help with a basic budgeting class. "They're mostly young mothers," she explained. "They could use someone patient, someone who actually knows what the word balance means outside of yoga." I laughed, the sound strange in my throat. She added, "You'd be good at it, you know. You look like someone who's had to make $1 do gymnastics." I told her I'd think about it, though I already knew I would say yes. It felt right, the idea of using the pieces of myself that hadn't yet gone stale. The following week, I walked into the community center carrying an old leather notebook and the nervousness of a first day at school. The place smelled faintly of bleach and crayons, a mix of cleanliness and persistence. The coordinator, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, greeted me warmly and led me to a small classroom where 6 women were already seated, notebooks open, pens poised like weapons against defeat. They looked up as I entered, polite but wary. I recognized that look. It's the one women wear when life has taught them not to expect much from anyone. I started by introducing myself simply. "I'm Margaret. I used to manage a small clinic, and before that, a household that could stretch $1 until it begged for mercy." They laughed softly, the first sound of trust cracking the room open. We began with basics: how to read statements, how to track expenses, how to plan for something beyond survival. Their questions were raw, practical, honest. "What do you do when the paycheck doesn't stretch?" one asked. "You stretch yourself less," I said, "and you fight for the rest." The words came out before I thought them through, and they hung in the air like something larger than advice. I saw a few of them write it down, as if it were a secret formula. For the first time in months, I felt usefully alive. After class, the coordinator thanked me and pressed a paper cup of coffee into my hands. "You've got a gift," she said. "You make people feel possible." I didn't tell her that I hadn't felt possible in a long time. I walked home in the cool afternoon light, past the bakery where the smell of fresh bread made the street seem kinder, past the park where children's laughter carried like an echo of something I'd forgotten. By the time I reached my front gate, I realized my shoulders had uncurled, my breath had steadied. It was a small shift, but I felt it. The difference between being alone and being unclaimed. That evening, I pulled out the envelope of documents from the drawer, the ones Melissa and her lawyer had sent, and spread them across the table, the neat columns of type, the clauses and subclauses, the signatures waiting like traps. It all looked strangely lifeless now, like paperwork from another existence. I read every word slowly, as if I were translating an ancient language. For the first time, I noticed the arrogance hidden in the phrasing. The beneficiary may assume responsibility in the event of mental or physical incapacity. I had signed similar language years ago for patients at the clinic. People who couldn't remember their own addresses. The thought made me laugh, not bitterly, but with a kind of astonished clarity. This was what Melissa had been preparing for, perhaps even believing, that I was already fading. That belief had become her permission. I stayed at the table long into the night. The documents fanned out around me like the broken feathers of a bird. Around midnight, I found my old will, the one I'd made after my husband's death, back when the house still smelled of paint and hope. The ink had faded slightly, but the intentions were clear. Part to Melissa, part to charity, part to the scholarship fund he and I had started for local nurses. It was a fair will, a balanced one, written from love, not guilt. I reread it carefully, then folded it closed. I realized that I didn't want to erase Melissa, only the illusion that love was conditional upon compliance. The next morning, I called the attorney who'd helped me all those years ago, a quiet man named George Whitman, who had retired but still kept a small office near the courthouse. His voice on the phone was steady and kind. "Of course I remember you, Mrs. Hill," he said. "You always knew your numbers better than most of my clients." When I explained what had happened, he was silent for a long moment before saying, "Come in tomorrow. Bring everything. We'll make sure no one writes your story for you." I hung up feeling lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. That night, I made myself a proper dinner: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a glass of wine. I ate slowly, savoring the ritual of caring for oneself not out of defiance, but out of respect. I thought of Melissa somewhere across the city, perhaps telling friends that her mother was being stubborn again, perhaps believing it was love that drove her interference. Maybe it was, twisted by fear and entitlement into something unrecognizable. But love, even when warped, doesn't excuse theft. The next day at George's office, I sat across from him as he adjusted his reading glasses and examined the stack of papers. His office smelled faintly of old books and furniture polish. "You've done everything right," he said. "You just need to make it official again on your own terms." He looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Would you like to keep the previous structure?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, I think I want to do something different." For the next hour, we drafted revisions, simple but decisive. The charity would remain, expanded even. The rest would go into a trust for my grandson, not accessible by anyone until he turned 25. As for Melissa, I left a small token, not enough to wound, but enough to remind her that love, once lost, still leaves a trace. When it was done, George looked up from his notes. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said, and I meant it. Signing the new document felt less like revenge and more like repair, It was the quiet restoration of ownership over my own life. Afterward, I walked to the cafe across the street and ordered coffee, sitting by the window as rain began to fall in fine silver threads. The city moved slowly outside, umbrellas blooming, people hurrying, taxis flashing in puddles. I felt invisible, but not erased, small but whole. There's a peculiar joy in reclaiming ordinary moments after you've been treated as a relic. When I returned home, the phone was blinking with a new message. I pressed play and listened to Melissa's voice, bright, brisk, almost cheerful. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. Hope everything's okay. I've been thinking maybe we got off on the wrong foot." Her tone was rehearsed, conciliatory in the way one might address a client, not a parent. I didn't call back. I simply stood there listening until the message ended, then deleted it. There are silences that wound and silences that heal. This one was the latter. The next few weeks followed a new rhythm. I taught my class twice a week, visited the library, and met Nora for coffee afterward. Sometimes we talked about books, sometimes about our children, sometimes about nothing at all. The companionship was gentle, undemanding. I even started writing small notes to myself, reminders that joy doesn't need permission. Buy lilies. Paint the porch. Don't apologize for surviving. One afternoon, on my way back from the center, I stopped by a small shop that sold secondhand furniture. Near the window stood a desk, solid oak, its surface scratched but dignified. I ran my hand along its edge, feeling the grooves, the years embedded in the wood. The owner told me it had belonged to a retired teacher who used it for grading papers. "It's sturdy," he said. "Not pretty, but built to last." I smiled. So am I. I bought it on the spot, arranged for delivery, and spent the next day rearranging the study to make space. When the movers left, I sat at the new desk, opened a blank notebook, and began to write. Not lists or budgets this time, but thoughts, memories, truths I hadn't spoken aloud. It felt like building a bridge back to myself. In the evenings, I would light a candle and read the pages I'd written that week, not to edit them, but to listen to my own voice without interruption. I realized that for years I had been narrating my life through others, through what Melissa needed, through what neighbors thought, through what society expected from an aging woman. But sitting there, ink staining my fingers, I understood that solitude can be a mirror, not a punishment. One night, as I closed the notebook, I caught my reflection in the window. My face softened by the candlelight, lines deepened, but not unkind. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see absence or age. I saw endurance. I whispered to the empty room, "I'm not fading. I'm forming." The sound startled me, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and promise. I turned off the lamp, walked to bed, and slept without dreams, certain that something had shifted for good. It was a Sunday when she came back, without warning again, the way people arrive when they believe the territory still belongs to them. I heard the car first, the low rumble in the driveway, the door slamming, the impatient rhythm of heels on the path. I didn't move to greet her. I stayed at the table with my cup of tea, pretending not to have noticed. The knock came sharp and fast, followed by her voice, louder than usual, deliberately cheerful. "Mom, it's me. Open up." I stood slowly, taking my time, letting her wait those few extra seconds that would remind her this was my house, not a hotel lobby. When I opened the door, Her face was already set in a smile too tight to be real. "You look well," she said. She was dressed as if for battle. Navy coat, expensive scarf, hair swept back into a careful bun. "Do I?" I asked. She ignored the tone, stepping inside without invitation, her perfume trailing after her like smoke. She looked around, scanning the room the way she always does now, as if searching for evidence of decline. Her gaze lingered on the papers spread across my new desk, on the notebooks, on the neat stack of folders tied with ribbon. "What's all this?" she asked lightly. "You've been busy." "I have," I said. "Life doesn't pause just because someone decides it should." She frowned, the kind of frown that hides itself behind polite restraint. "You could have told me you were making changes," she said. "I heard from George Whitman's office. They mentioned you visited." I almost smiled. "Did they?" "He's retired, Mom," she said sharply. "You shouldn't be bothering him with complicated paperwork. You need someone who's up to date." "I need someone who listens," I replied, my voice calm but hard as frost. She exhaled through her nose, a habit she picked up when she was little and wanted to hide her frustration. "You've always been dramatic," she said. "This doesn't have to be a fight." She sat down across from me at the table, placed her handbag beside her, and produced a folder, sleek and new, embossed with the name of a different law firm. "I came to make things simpler," she said, opening it with practiced efficiency. Inside were more papers, forms, letters, copies of statements I hadn't shared. I recognized some of the information. Other parts were unfamiliar, adjusted, reinterpreted. She slid a page toward me, tapping it gently with her finger. "This is the revised plan. It protects everyone." I didn't touch it. I looked at her hand instead, steady and manicured, the nails pale pink, the skin taut with impatience. "Everyone," I repeated. "That word keeps changing meaning in your mouth." For a moment she said nothing, and then she leaned back, crossing her arms. "You're being unfair," she said. "I'm trying to make sure you're safe." "You're not thinking about what happens if I die," I interrupted. "We've established that I will. The question is what happens before." The silence that followed was long, heavy, almost sacred in its stillness. She looked at me as though I'd insulted her religion. "You don't have to make this so difficult," she said finally. "It's just paperwork." "No," I said. "It's power, and you've mistaken my quiet for surrender." She sighed loudly, pushed the folder closer to me. "Please, Mom, don't make me the bad guy." I laughed, softly, but without humor. "You keep saying that, as if you're auditioning for a role. Maybe you should stop worrying about who's the villain and start asking why you need one at all." Her eyes narrowed. "You think this is about greed," she said, "but it's about control." "I'm trying to control the chaos you'll leave behind." I tilted my head, studying her. "I didn't realize my existence was so inconvenient." "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant." Her voice rose then, breaking its professional calm. "You don't understand how hard this is for me," she said. "Do you think I want to have these conversations? Do you think it's easy worrying about what will happen when you're gone? About who has to clean up the mess?" I looked at her and felt, for a fleeting second, not anger, but pity. She was still that little girl who needed to arrange the world into categories of safety, who couldn't stand disorder. But pity is a dangerous softness. It invites forgiveness before repentance. I couldn't afford that. I didn't raise you to see love as maintenance, I said quietly. I raised you to stand on your own 2 feet. She stared at me, her eyes wet but unyielding. Maybe you raised me to expect too much, she said. You made it look easy, holding everything together, fixing everyone's problems. I thought that's what family meant. Family, I said, means letting people choose, even when it scares you. She looked away then, blinking quickly, composing herself. You're not being reasonable, she said, her voice returning to its familiar managerial cadence. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment. This isn't about us. It's about your legacy. I smiled again, but this time it reached my eyes. Then let it be a legacy of choice. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. You'll regret this, she said. Maybe not now, but later. Later, I said, is all I have left, and I'd like to spend it belonging to myself. She hesitated by the doorway, her face tightening, as though she wanted to say something else. Something tender, perhaps, but couldn't find the words. Instead, she said, I hope you know you're making it impossible for me to help you. I didn't reply. I just walked past her, opened the door, and stood aside. She stepped out without another glance. The sound of her heels on the stone path faded until it was swallowed by the wind. When I closed the door, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only a deep, steady calm, the kind that follows after surviving a storm that hasn't quite ended. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the candle flame. I thought about how every woman I'd ever known had been told, in one way or another, that her resistance was ingratitude. When we say no, they call it cruelty. When we protect ourselves, they call it selfishness. I realized that Melissa wasn't exceptional in her cruelty. She was ordinary in her entitlement. The tragedy wasn't her greed, but her inability to imagine love that didn't translate into ownership. That realization freed me more than any legal document ever could. But freedom has its price. A few days later, the calls began. Not from her, but from others. The lawyer again, polite but firmer, reminding me of pending matters. A neighbor, Mrs. Carter, knocking at my door with a casserole and an expression of grave sympathy, murmuring, I heard you're not well. Melissa's so worried. Then the pastor from the local church, who hadn't spoken to me in years, calling to ask if I'd like him to stop by and pray for clarity. Each gesture was dressed in care, but carried the same message. You are losing credibility, and we are here to supervise your decline. I smiled through each conversation, thanked them, and took notes in my journal afterward. Dates, names, words. I wanted a record not for revenge, but for truth. One evening, I received a letter, handwritten this time, the paper thick and scented faintly of her perfume. Mom, it began. I'm sorry for how things went. I just want what's best for you. Please call me so we can fix this before it's too late. The handwriting was neat but controlled, as if each loop of her pen had been ironed into place. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it under the candle on my desk. I let the wax drip slowly until it sealed the edges together. I didn't burn it, I just preserved it, a fossil of manipulation disguised as apology. At the community center, the women noticed I seemed quieter that week. During class, one of them, a young mother named Serena, said, You look like someone who's winning a battle no one knows about. I smiled faintly. Or losing one, I said. She shook her head. No, you've got that look in your eyes, like someone who's finally stopped asking permission. Her words lodged deep in me. That night, I wrote them down. Stopped asking permission. Days passed, and I began to feel stronger in my solitude. I painted the porch a deep green, trimmed the hedges, replaced the broken tiles in the bathroom. Each task became a declaration of life, an assertion that I wasn't the frail ghost my daughter had written into existence. Yet beneath that calm, I could sense the next wave building. It came a week later in the form of a knock at the door. It wasn't Melissa this time, but a man in a dark suit holding a leather briefcase. His expression was practiced neutrality. "Mrs. Hill," he said, showing his credentials. "I'm here to conduct an assessment." "An assessment of what?" I asked. "Just a standard wellness check, ma'am. Your daughter requested it." I felt the blood drain from my face, but my voice stayed level. "You can tell my daughter that my wellness is none of her business. Good day." I closed the door before he could respond. I stood there afterward, hands trembling slightly, then laughed. A short, bitter sound that startled even me. It was absurd, this performance of concern, this theater of righteousness. She had tried to have me evaluated, as though I were an incompetent stranger. The realization didn't wound me this time. It clarified everything. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to erase the parts of me that refused obedience. That evening, I called George again and explained what had happened. He listened in silence, then said quietly, "We'll make sure she can't do that again. I'll file the proper notice." I thanked him, and after hanging up, I sat for a long time watching the dusk fade through the window. The world outside was calm, unaware of the invisible wars fought behind family curtains. The next morning, I received an email from Melissa. The subject line read, "Please." Inside was a short message. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Can we meet? Just talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed a single line in reply. "You can come on Tuesday. Alone." She arrived late in the afternoon, wearing softer clothes this time. No lawyer, no folder, no performance. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her mouth drawn tight. We sat in the kitchen again, just as we had that first morning when she said the unforgivable thing. For a while, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked. The kettle hissed. The air between us thick with memory. Finally, she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you." I nodded. "But you did." "I just wanted to feel safe," she said. "You made me feel like I was losing you." "You were never losing me," I said. "You were losing control." Her hands clenched around her mug. "You think I'm selfish," she said. "But I was scared." "Fear doesn't justify cruelty," I said gently. "It explains it, but it doesn't excuse it." We sat in silence again. Then she whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." I looked at her for a long time, the lines of her face so familiar they almost blurred into my own reflection. "You don't fix it," I said. "You stop repeating it." When she left that evening, she didn't threaten or argue. She just kissed my forehead, awkwardly, like a gesture borrowed from another life. After she was gone, I walked to the window and watched her drive away, the taillights vanishing into the blue dusk. I didn't know if she meant her apology, but I knew it didn't matter anymore. Some reconciliations don't need agreement. They just need finality. That night, for the first time in years, I slept deeply, without waking to check the locks, without dreaming of confrontation. The next morning, I opened the window, let the cold air rush in, and felt the sunlight touch my hands. I realized then that peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you create by refusing to be rewritten. The morning I decided to change the will for good, the sky was a clean, pale gray, the kind that makes everything feel suspended between decision and forgiveness. I woke early, long before the alarm, long before the city began its usual hum. There was a stillness that seemed to belong only to me. I made coffee the way I used to when my husband was alive, slowly, deliberately, measuring the water as if precision could summon comfort. As I waited for it to brew, I looked around the kitchen, at the familiar worn tiles, the faded curtains, the faint scratches on the table where Melissa once did her homework. All of it looked both tender and foreign, as though it belonged to someone who had already gone. I had spent months moving through these rooms trying to preserve what was left of myself, but that morning, I realized preservation was just another form of waiting. What I wanted was not to keep, but to conclude. The decision wasn't born of anger. Anger had burned itself out weeks before, leaving behind something calmer and sharper: clarity. I had already met with George to draft the new version, but I hadn't signed it yet. A part of me had been waiting, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps because the act of signing would make everything irreversible, and irreversible things carry their own gravity. But now, as I sat with the steaming mug between my hands, I knew it was time. There was a strange serenity in that certainty, as if the chaos of the past months had finally condensed into a single, unshakable truth. I owed no one an apology for protecting my own name. I dressed carefully, choosing my gray wool coat and the scarf my husband had bought me in Florence decades ago. The fabric was soft and smelled faintly of cedar. It reminded me of the woman I had been then, curious, decisive, unafraid to occupy space. When I stepped outside, the cold met me like an honest friend. The air tasted of metal and damp leaves. I walked to the bus stop rather than calling a cab. I wanted to feel the movement of the world around me, to pass strangers who didn't know my history, who would never see me as a fading figure at the edge of her own story. The bus ride downtown was slow, filled with the usual quiet symphony of morning: a man coughing into his scarf, a child whispering questions to his mother, the low hum of the engine blending with the rhythm of rain against the windows. I found it oddly comforting. I thought of how Melissa would have hated this. She would have insisted on driving, on controlling the route, the timing, the destination. But there was peace in relinquishing that control to something larger, something as indifferent as public transportation. When I arrived at George's office, he greeted me with that same gentle professionalism I had come to rely on. He had set out the papers already, neatly aligned on his desk, a pen placed precisely at the corner. "You're sure?" he asked, though we both knew the question was ceremonial. "I'm sure," I said. My voice sounded firm even to my own ears. "Let's make it official." He nodded, turned the pages toward me, and began reading the clauses aloud, his tone even and deliberate. The words filled the room with their quiet finality. "To the Women's Shelter of St. Mary's, for their continued service to those in need. To the educational trust established in the name of Benjamin Hill, to be accessed upon his 25th birthday. To my daughter, Melissa Hart, a letter to be opened at the discretion of the executor." He paused before the last line, looking up at me. "A letter?" he asked softly. "Yes," I said. "Just a few words. It felt necessary." I reached into my purse and handed him the sealed envelope. The paper inside was thick, cream-colored, folded twice. On the front, I had written her name in ink, dark enough to bleed slightly into the fibers. Inside, the message was brief. I changed my will, just as you asked. I changed it to reflect who truly stood by me. If you wish to know why, listen, not to defend, but to understand. When the signing was done, I felt an odd lightness, as though I had been carrying an invisible weight, and finally set it down. George shook my hand, his grip firm but kind. "You've done something brave," he said. "Most people your age let others make their decisions for them." I smiled. "Most people my age are told that's what love looks like," I said. "But love isn't obedience. It's presence." He nodded, not as a lawyer, but as a man who understood the language of letting go. On the way home, the rain had stopped. The city glistened as though freshly washed, the sidewalks reflecting the soft light of a sun still hidden behind clouds. I stopped at a cafe I hadn't visited in years and ordered a sandwich and a glass of white wine. The waiter looked surprised, but pleased when I said I wanted to eat alone. I took a seat by the window and watched people hurry past. Couples, students, workers with their collars turned up against the chill. They all looked so absorbed in their momentum, their endless forwardness. I envied them a little, but I also pitied them. They didn't yet know how fragile the illusion of control really is. Halfway through my meal, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa. "I heard from George. So you did it. I hope you're happy." I stared at the words, trying to imagine her face as she typed them, the tightening jaw, the restless fingers, the shallow breath of someone who still believed that love was a negotiation. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in silence. Instead, I turned off the phone and slipped it into my purse. I raised my glass, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, and whispered to the reflection in the window, "Yes, I am." When I returned home, the house greeted me like an old friend. The air was still, carrying that faint scent of paper and dust and time. I walked from room to room, touching the edges of furniture, the backs of chairs, the worn banister of the staircase. Each object felt solid again, reclaimed. In the study, the afternoon light spilled across the desk, illuminating the faint marks left by the pen where I'd practiced my signature days before. I sat down and opened my notebook. For a while, I just stared at the blank page, listening to the ticking of the clock. Then I began to write. Not lists or reflections this time, but something closer to testimony. I wrote about what it meant to age in a world that values compliance, about how easily a woman's choices are mistaken for confusion once her hair turns gray. I wrote about the difference between being cared for and being managed, between being loved and being owned. Hours passed unnoticed. By the time I stopped, the light had turned amber, the kind of light that forgives even the ugliest corners. I read what I had written and felt no need to change a word. There was truth in its roughness, strength in its simplicity. I closed the notebook, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it in the top drawer of the desk. Someday, perhaps, Benjamin would find it, or maybe no one would. It didn't matter. It wasn't for legacy. It was for release. That evening, the doorbell rang. I knew before I opened it that it would be her. Melissa stood there, her face pale, eyes wide, the expression of someone who has finally realized that control doesn't guarantee closeness. She held her phone in one hand as though it were a shield. "You really did it," she said. I nodded. "I did? You cut me out." "No," I said softly. "You cut yourself out. I just stopped holding the door open." She blinked, the words hitting her with delayed force. "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice trembling. "You were trying to own me," I replied. For a moment she looked like she might cry, but then her shoulders stiffened. "Do you know how this makes me look?" she asked. The question was so absurd that I laughed, a low, warm laugh that surprised even me. "You're still worried about appearances," I said. "That's the difference between us. You build your life out of perception. I'm finally living mine out of truth." She stepped closer, her voice breaking. "You'll regret this," she said. "Maybe not now, but one day when I'm gone, when there's no one left." "Melissa," I interrupted gently, "the tragedy isn't that one day you'll be gone. It's that while you're still here, you don't know how to stay." Her face crumpled then, the mask slipping. For a brief, piercing instant, I saw the child she used to be, the one who clung to my sleeve during thunderstorms. I wanted to reach for her, but the space between us had grown too solid, too necessary. "I love you," I said quietly, "but I will not apologize for teaching you that love has boundaries." She stared at me for a long time, breathing unevenly, then turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door gently, not in anger, but in mercy. On the other side, I heard the sound of her car starting, the wheels crunching against the wet gravel. Then, nothing. Just the pulse of my own heart, steady and certain. I sat down again at the desk, the candle flickering beside me. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth. I thought of all the women I had met at the community center, all those faces marked by struggle and endurance. I thought of the girl Melissa once was, and the woman I had become, and the quiet lineage of strength that connected us, however broken. Then I whispered to the silence, "It's done," and felt for the first time in years entirely free. It has been 6 months since that afternoon, and the air around me feels different now, lighter, like the pressure that once sat inside my chest has finally learned to dissolve. I wake up each morning without dread, without that half-second hesitation where I used to wonder whether I was still someone's obligation or someone's defiance. The house no longer feels like a battlefield. It has gone back to being simply a house, a place that shelters, that listens, that holds the quiet the way an old friend holds your secrets. The garden has come alive again. The hydrangeas I thought had died last winter are blooming with a stubborn kind of beauty, and the lilac bush by the fence has stretched toward the light in a way I never expected it to. I spend my mornings out there now, pruning, watering, humming to myself. The neighbors wave when they pass, not out of pity anymore, but out of the easy familiarity that comes when a person seems grounded in her own rhythm. I suppose I have become a fixture of the street again, the old woman with the green porch and the steady gaze. That suits me fine. Melissa hasn't been here since that night. We speak sometimes, brief, polite conversations about weather, health, her son's school, but nothing heavy. It's a strange sort of peace, fragile, yet breathable. She treads carefully, as if one wrong word might shatter the truce. Perhaps she finally understands that I will not move backward, that the time of pleading and explaining is over, There's a certain mercy in distance, in not trying to force closeness where there is only misunderstanding. Sometimes, when I hear her voice on the phone, softer now, cautious, I sense a shadow of the girl she once was, and I let it comfort me instead of ache. Maybe that is forgiveness. Not a grand gesture, but the absence of need. The will has been settled, the papers are filed and stored. George retired for good not long after, and when he called to say goodbye, he told me he'd kept a copy of my letter to Melissa as a reminder that not every story about aging ends in surrender. I liked that. The women at the community center still meet twice a week, and I continue to teach them. The class has grown. There are new faces every month, new stories of survival and small victories. They call me Miss Margaret now, and they bring me coffee before we start, insisting I shouldn't lift a finger. I laugh and tell them that lifting fingers is precisely what keeps me alive. I've learned that helping others is not the same as saving them. It's simply witnessing their fight without letting them forget they still have one. In the afternoons, I sometimes walk to the waterfront. The path there is long and uneven, the kind that forces you to pay attention to where you step. The wind off the water carries the smell of salt and rust, and the gulls move in lazy circles above the old docks. I sit on the same bench each time, the one with peeling blue paint, and watch the tide creep forward, then slide back again. It feels like watching time itself, persistent, indifferent, yet oddly kind. I think of how much of my life was spent trying to hold things in place, people, promises, memories. But tides are wiser than we are. They know when to withdraw, when to return, and when to leave the shore untouched. Sometimes I see Benjamin there, my grandson, now taller than I am, his shoulders broadening with the uncertain confidence of youth. He meets me after school, brings his sketchbook, and sits quietly beside me, drawing the boats. He doesn't ask about the past. He doesn't mention his mother or the stories she might have told him. He just draws, and we share the kind of silence that doesn't need translation. Once as we watched the water, he said, "Mom says you're strong." I smiled, feeling both proud and weary. Strength, I told him, is just another name for remembering who you are when people try to tell you otherwise. He nodded, as though he understood, and kept sketching. In that moment, I realized that what I had feared losing, the thread between generations, hadn't been broken after all. It had simply found a quieter way to exist. There are nights when I still dream of Melissa as a child. In those dreams, she's running through the garden, her hair tangled, her laughter high and wild, calling for me to come see the butterfly she's caught in her hands. I follow her voice, but by the time I reach her, the butterfly is gone, flown out of her grasp, leaving her standing there bewildered and empty-handed. I always wake before I can comfort her, but I no longer cry when I do. I've learned that some parts of motherhood are eternal tasks. You keep trying to catch what has already flown, not because you think you can, but because the act of reaching is what keeps you tender. I've started writing letters again, not to anyone in particular. Some are to my younger self, some to my husband, some to women I'll never meet. I write them in the evenings, when the house hums softly around me and the smell of the garden drifts in through the window. The letters are not confessions or instructions. They're simply acknowledgments. I write about what it means to outlive expectation, about the quiet rebellion of staying visible, about how dignity is not something given by others, but something you build each time you refuse to vanish. When I finish each letter, I fold it carefully and place it in the old tin box where my first will used to be. It feels right, somehow, that the space once meant for division now holds words, meant for continuity. Last week, I booked a small trip, a train ride to the coast, just for a few days. I told Nora at the library, and she clapped her hands like a child. "About time," she said. I suppose she's right. I've lived so long in defense that I almost forgot movement can be its own form of faith. I plan to walk the length of the pier, eat something too sweet, and sit by the sea until the sound of the waves is the only language left in my head. A woman should die moving, I once wrote in my journal, and though I'm not dying yet, I understand now what I meant. Movement doesn't always mean distance. Sometimes it's simply the willingness to live without permission. Tonight, as I sit by the window watching the last light fade, I think about what remains: the house, the garden, the notebooks, the small circle of people who see me not as an inheritance, but as a person, and the certainty, quiet, unglamorous, but steady, that I have already done the hardest thing a woman can do. I have stopped waiting for validation. I no longer need to be the mother she remembers or the woman the world prefers. I am simply myself, complete in the unfinished way that life demands. I hope someday Melissa understands that what I did was not rejection, but truth. That love, when honest, sometimes looks like distance. That boundaries are not walls but mirrors, forcing us to see what we keep trying to hide. And if she never understands, that's all right too. The lesson was for me as much as for her. The air has cooled now. The night smells faintly of lilac and soil. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle calls, long and low, and I imagine the tracks stretching endlessly toward places I haven't seen yet. I finish my tea, close my notebook, and whisper into the dark. I'm ready. Not for endings, those come regardless, but for whatever small beginning still waits at the edge of things. Then I turn off the light, leaving the room aglow only with the reflection of the moon on the garden's glass, and for the first time in many years I feel whole.